This is Jeff Badge of the Grinding Doc, continuing my series on the great papers, the great research work of Professor Stephen Malkin. Malkin was probably the world grinding guru, perhaps the greatest grinder to ever live. Some people may take issue with that, depending. But in my opinion, the best papers for getting a hardcore understanding of grinding from first principles was Malkin. And I think that's what set Malkin apart was he didn't just do a bunch of research and say, hey man, I did a bunch of experiments and here are the results. He said, hey man, I did a bunch of experiments and I'm going to explain the results based on the first principles of science, Newton's laws of motion, the fundamentals of stress and strain and material deformation, the fundamentals of heat transfer. And the nice thing about it is if you explain something from first principles, you can then extrapolate it, if you're careful, to other types of grinding. So you can do a bunch of experiments in surface grinding and say, all right, I'm going to transfer that to cylindrical ID grinding, and it'll mostly work most of the time, depending, as long as you're careful. I'm going to do a bunch of experiments on grinding of ceramics, but instead of just grinding a bunch of ceramics, I'm going to look at pictures of what are the mechanisms of material removal. Or here, what we're going to talk about is carbide grinding. He said, okay, I'm going to grind tungsten carbide drills. What in the bloody hell is tungsten carbide drills? And instead of just grinding tungsten carbide and saying, okay, here's the results, he said, well, tungsten carbide is different than steel because it's less ductile. It is more brittle. It has less strain to failure, lower ductility. And how does that affect things? And so this was when Malkin had moved to Haifa in Israel. So he was at MIT, finished his Ph.D. Then I went to University of Texas at Austin, and then Haifa, and then Amherst. There may have been a stop or two on the way that I missed, but that's how I remember it. And here we have grinding of tungsten carbide, cobalt, cemented carbides. And so Malkin did some experiments. He measured the specific energy and he measured the G ratio. That's a very nice curve to have because as your G ratio gets higher, you typically have a smaller grit penetration depth. You typically have lower forces, so you get higher specific energies because you're doing more rubbing. And he did it for one depth of cut and two depths of cut and different grit diameters or different mesh sizes. And then he did it for coating and uncoated grits too. So he's doing it from first principles, doing his homework. Then he gives us the properties of the different grades of tungsten carbide that he was doing, because not all tungsten carbide is created equal. Some has more cobalt, some has less, some has smaller grain sizes. And then sometimes they throw in some other stuff. Not cermets, that's a different animal, but they throw in some other stuff. And that was of interest to me because I did a lot of work on high-speed steels, for example, where you can get a huge difference in the grindability based on different grades. Tungsten carbide, the differences are not near as big. And then he's given us his wheels. He's giving us details on the wheels, which I appreciate. The grit size, the concentration, the percent volume of diamond, which should just be based on the concentration. And then he gives us the normal tangential force versus different depths of cut and feed rates. And if you take my class and you look in the book of grinding, you'll see data plucked from here. And I plucked out all those data points and then I reprocess them based on the grit penetration depth or the aggressiveness if you prefer. In fact, this is one I talk about quite a bit, but Malkin is doing just good experimental work, telling us what's going on. He's telling us how the specific energy varies, how it doesn't really matter as much as you might think or as much as I might expect for different workpiece materials. And that's good stuff. That's what we need to know. And so the nice thing about Malkin papers is you can extract a lot of meaning, meaning about life, meaning about grinding, from a lot of graphs that aren't necessarily even that's the main purpose. But like here, I can say, okay, is there a huge difference for different grades of carbide? Yeah, there's some. Not as big as some other materials, but yes, there is some. And then we have feed rates and stuff like that. He's doing it at different grit sizes, which tells us something else to say, hey, the grit size is not affecting things that much. And then Malkin measured the cutting point density. And this is fabulous stuff. This is good because this gives us an understanding based on first principles of what's going on. So we have the cutting point density here for different grit sizes. And then what makes cutting point density complicated is cutting point density depends on how deep you go into the wheel. And when I talk about the grit penetration depth or my aggressiveness equation, I say, well, grit penetration depth depends on cutting point density. And then cutting point density depends on grit penetration depth. So we have this maddening situation because as you increase the grit penetration depth, more grits are going to get in the action and your cutting point density is going to change, which makes calculating the grit penetration depth complicated. All right, so here we have it here, and we say, man, at the first few microns, they're all pretty much the same. And then once we get deeper in the wheel, we see quite a big difference. And then Malkin normalizes it based on what the theoretical value is. If you took a plane and passed it through a grinding wheel, that's very interesting to say, okay, it approaches 1 for the big grits, but for the small grits, it doesn't. Really useful stuff, really good stuff to give us an understanding. Then he looks at the scratch depth, which is interesting because is that going to change for a brittle material? And then he gives us a electron microscope photo of tungsten carbide swarf. And it doesn't look completely like steel swarf. It's short and blocky. There's still chips. There's still ductile flow. It's not like ceramic material, but it doesn't have the long skinny chips that steel has because tungsten carbide, mostly tungsten carbide, a little bit of cobalt, where steel is, let's say, mostly iron carbon steel and a little bit of other stuff thrown in. So we don't have the same ductility. And here we got some pictures. So there they are. So they look sort of like steel, not quite. And then Malkin takes it a step further and says, hey, there is a smooth side and there is a rough side, just like we see in grinding of steels, just like we see in turning, milling, and drilling. So we're getting into first principles of what's going on here. Oh, and there he shows the rough side and the smooth side. And then he starts getting into some chip thickness stuff. And then he gives us a view of the ground surface, which I appreciate. Does the ground surface look different for carbide compared to steel? And then we have specific energy versus this parameter. This parameter is probably proportional to grit penetration depth or proportional to aggressiveness, which I like if you keep the same wheel speed. And so we say, hey, the inverse of aggressiveness is specific energy. Good, makes sense. And then he quotes Hughes, one of the other grinding greats, who did some work in the 60s and 70s on carbide grinding. And he references Coes, the guy who wrote the book on grit properties. And then he gives a summary of his results, which I always like because sometimes I like to reprocess results. So that's it. Jeff Badger talking about the great grinding papers of Stephen Malkin. And this is the great grinding paper when he probably was the first. There may have been others. Someone may watch this video and say, hey, no, man, there was a German guy in 1938 who did it. But at least this is the first time I'm aware of someone giving us grinding of tungsten carbide from first principles, and that's what makes Malkin's papers great. So Jeff Badger, the grinding doc, talking about the great papers of Professor Stephen Malkin.